you. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning. David Kilpatrick is a professor of psychology for the State University of New York College at Cortland. He's a New York State certified school psychologist with 28 years of experience in schools. He's been teaching courses in learning disabilities and educational psychology since 1994. Dr. Kilpatrick is a reading researcher and author of 2 books on reading, The Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties, and Equipped for Reading Success, and is co-editor of a 3rd book, Reading Development and Difficulties, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Practice. Dr. Kilpatrick has really done amazing work in connecting the reading research with the practical applications to the field of psychology and education. I've had the pleasure to hear him speak on several previous occasions, and we're in for a real treat this morning. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kilpatrick.
Okay. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good, okay. Well, good morning, and you're in for kind of a fast-paced whirlwind trip through some of the highlights of reading research, and then I want to show how they connect to the new WIAT-4. This wasn't really planned or scripted ahead of time, and I'm too far away that they can't kick me under the table, but I did want to mention that I was contacted back in, I think, 2017 or 2018 by the folks at Pearson about updating the WIAT-4. And they asked if I would help with that, with the reading-related subtest. I said yes, but under one condition: I don't receive any sort of financial benefit from that, because I want to recommend it when it's done without any financial disclosure involved. And so I'm at any work I do for them or anybody else, actually, I'm just happy to help. And so they did send me a free copy of the test, by the way. That's my one disclosure. But I'm very excited about it, and just because I have no financial interest doesn't mean I'm not biased. I'm obviously biased. If you spend time volunteering at a local soup kitchen, of course you're going to talk it up, right? Not that this is a local soup kitchen, but you get my point. So certainly I have a biased opinion, but there's no financial involvement whatsoever. Okay, with that said, we have a pretty ambitious schedule of things to talk about. As I mentioned, it's going to be kind of a fast whirlwind. First of all, the big picture. We're going to talk about the simple view of reading and where eventually where the subtests from the WIAT-4 fit into that. Just to mention about the simple view of reading, the reading research is huge. People often don't realize that. Folks in my field, the school psychology field, folks in education, special education, speech pathology, most of them are not aware that there's a gigantic enterprise of reading research that involves tens of millions of our tax dollars in the United States, also huge funding in the UK, Australia, Germany, France, et cetera. It's a very large enterprise with about 1,000 scientifically oriented research studies that appear in English every year. Now, not all of those are on English. English is the international language of science, but I'd say a good 50 to 60% of those studies are on English. So because with that many studies, nobody can stay on top of all of it. And we have multiple niche areas within the reading research. And I'm going to be focusing on a few niche areas. There's got to be at least 24 niche areas. I mean, just like in medicine, just like in psychology, there are niche areas. I'm going to focus on a few of those: orthographic learning, dyslexia, phonological processes in reading, and just a little bit dabble into the research on intervention, but also a bit with assessment. So with that said, there's really only one overarching theory that covers across all the different domains within the reading research, and that would be the simple view of reading. So we're going to talk about that. It's going to be very important, and it should guide how we approach assessment and intervention for reading, as well as just general instruction. Our curriculum should be designed around that. Next, I want to talk about the basic nature of word-level reading. This may sound very obvious, but as we go into it with a little bit of depth, you're going to say maybe some things weren't so obvious. And those things that we need to know about can have a big impact on what we teach. Along that line is the fact that there are 2 different levels of word reading. We want to have a real focus on that. There's 2 levels of word reading among skilled word readers. Number 1 is to reliably sound out unfamiliar words that you don't know. And secondly is to become good at remembering words. I mean, let's face it, when we read, we're not sounding out words as we go along. We are recalling words from some kind of data bank of familiar words. And for educated adults, we're talking, depending on your age and how many years you've been reading, somewhere between 20 and 70,000 words that we already have in our data bank of familiar words. So how does that happen? How do we add those words to our long-term memory? And that's really kind of goes on. But the next point is how does that happen? Because that's going to be critical. And there are some tests out there, including items from the new WIAT, that will give us some insight into that process. And so we want to learn what are the key skills that go into both of those levels of word reading. And then it's very important that we distinguish between phonological awareness or phonemic awareness tasks and skills. I'll come back to that in a little more detail, but right now we have focused too much on tasks and not enough on skills. The question is, what skills, what does phonological awareness have to do with reading in the first place? And what phonological skills do we need? And we get hung up on the specific tasks we give as if each of these tasks represent a skill. But tasks and skills are not the same thing. And then why do some kids struggle? Why are there children that, despite any obvious reason, they struggle in learning to read? They're putting in the effort. They seem plenty bright. And they've had opportunity. Why does that happen? We have a pretty good idea on that. That's from the niche area in the reading research that we refer to as dyslexia research. Don't get hung up on that word dyslexia. We'll come back to it. And then talk about a little bit about why some of our word identification tests don't maybe do as well as they probably should. And then we'll also talk a little bit about compensators. Actually, the list is not complete here. We're going to talk about assessment toward the end. All right, with that stated, let's talk about the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading, it's called simple only at the most basic level, and that is this. Reading comprehension, which is the whole goal of reading in the first place, is based on two very broad skills. That's the simple part. After that, it gets very complex. The two broad skills are, number one, the ability to efficiently get the words off the page and accurately. When I say efficiently is going to include speed and accuracy here. So you're able to read the words on the page pretty efficiently. And secondly, you're able to understand the language that the text is written in, not just the language generically, but that. So for example, a child may understand English who's 7 years old very well, but the text might be a physics textbook. And of course, the language is above that child's comprehension level. So that's not what I'm not talking about just general language comprehension. Language comprehension to the level that whatever is written there on the page would be something that the child would understand if someone read it to him or her. That's the important part. Children, by the way, can have pretty good daily conversation language comprehension and still struggle with more in-depth language concepts and lack some background where they wouldn't understand what's written even if you read it to them. So if you're able to read something to a child and they understood it, and the child's able to efficiently read those words off the page without putting a lot of mental effort into it, their reading comprehension of that text is going to be pretty good. So here's the mathematical formula. Reading comprehension equals word level reading times listening comprehension or language comprehension. There you go. So that's where it's called simple, because it can break down in those two broad categories. But when we start looking at all the skills that go into reading words off the page and all the skills that go into comprehending language, it gets very complex. And we're not going to get into that complexity too much. We will a little bit, because it's going to drive both our assessments as well as drive our instruction and intervention. And we're going to focus on the word level reading today. A little bit we'll dabble into the language comprehension, because there is a listening comprehension subtest on the Wechsler that is roughly parallel to the reading comprehension. The big difference is that in one case the child's reading, in the other case they're being read to, and that's going to be useful. All right, so before we try to assess a child's reading, particularly word level reading, which is our focus today, we need to know what word reading is all about. What is the nature of reading in an alphabetic writing system? Well, in China, there are over 20 different languages. two of the most common languages. In the West, we refer to as Mandarin and Cantonese. Now, let's say if you spoke only one of those and that was your exclusive language, the Mandarin speaker is going to have a hard time speaking with someone who speaks Cantonese and vice versa because they're different oral languages. But the two of them may be able to read the same newspaper at the same time. How can that be? Because the Chinese writing system, the traditional Chinese writing system, is not keyed into the sounds that are made when people speak. But an alphabetic writing system is. So alphabetic writing, whether it's English or Spanish or French or German or Italian, any kind of alphabetic writing system is designed to capture the sound sequences within spoken words. So now this may sound kind of strange, but we don't write words in the same way that the sun does not rise and the sun does not set. That's just language we use. In the same way, we don't write words. They write words in Chinese. But in English and Spanish and every other alphabetic language, we write phoneme characters. We write phoneme characters, we string them together in a sequence, and we refer to that total number of as a printed word. Now, alphabetic writing, the name alphabet is not very useful because it's based on the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. A more descriptive and accurate term of the nature of alphabetic writing would be to call it a phonemic writing system, because each of the letters, or in some cases combination of letters, like a TH, SH, CH, etc., or OO, EE, each letter, in some cases OUGH or IGH, each of the characters are designed to represent individual phonemes. Those are called graphemes. So a grapheme is one or more letter designed to represent a single phoneme. Now, before I go any further, I don't want to assume too much, but let me explain what a phoneme is. A phoneme is the smallest unit of our spoken language that allows us to distinguish one word or one syllable from another. So, and you're going to have to apologize for any pronunciations, my upstate New York accent here, especially with the vowels. But had and hat, those are two separate syllables, and they're made up of phonemes, and it's the phonemes that allow us to distinguish had from hat or had from hid. The only difference between the two is a phoneme. But phonemes don't appear in isolation. There's only 3 to 4 words in English where the whole word is just a single phoneme. That would be like the article a, or a, like a book, or the AWE is just a single phoneme. In some parts of the English-speaking world, I is, but many parts I is really 2 phonemes. It's a diphthong, I, 2 different sounds. And what's the last one I'm thinking of? O, like it used to be O, exclamation point, now it's just OH. That's it. Every other phoneme is connected, in all other words in English are connected to other phonemes, and so they're co-articulated. So had and hid, you can't pull apart. If you were to look at a waveform of the word had, it wouldn't be the waveform would say had. So they're co-articulated. But so a phoneme is a rather abstract concept, but it does allow us to distinguish one syllable from another or one word from another. Had and hid are different by one. Hid and kid are different by one single phoneme. Okay, that's the level at which an alphabetic writing system works. It's not based on larger spoken units. So I more or less said that, didn't I? So poor access to the phonemic structure of the spoken language makes reading any alphabetic writing system difficult. And that's very important. Now, most people will grant that, okay, I realize that phonemic skills have got to be important for sounding out words, but for remembering words, that is not obvious. It's true, but it's certainly not obvious. It's something that from scientific investigation over the last 3 to 4 decades, we've been able to determine. And I'll go into that in more depth on that. So that's definitely counterintuitive. So the 2 levels of word reading, first of all, and I already mentioned what they were, the first is the ability to efficiently identify unfamiliar words. And the best way to do that is by sounding them out. Unfortunately, we've had a few decades of trying to teach kids that using letters to sound out is just one tool in the toolbox. And you use a heavy emphasis on guessing and using context, etc. So you have a situation where a child sees a sentence and they read it and they say, the family drove to the market. Oh, market, right? So now the child has tracked through the entire word, didn't didn't come out exactly right, but context helped them realize that it's a market. But if you use the other approach where it's just one tool in the toolbox, maybe a couple of the letters at most, the family drove to you look at the first letter and maybe context, museum. And then the kid keeps reading, and maybe a couple sentences in, they realize they're not talking about a museum, they're talking about a market, right? So being able to track through an entire word phonemically and get at least close. Many times you're going to get a direct hit, but get at least close enough that the context can resolve any sort of ambiguity is the most efficient way. Guessing from context has been studied extensively, and it is very inefficient, despite claims to the contrary. And then secondly, sounding, by the way, backing up a little bit, all skilled readers are good at both of these. Skilled readers are good at sounding out nonsense words, even if they were never taught by a phonic approach. So phonic skills, the ability to track through letter by letter, sound by sound, or I should say grapheme by grapheme, to come to either a direct hit or a very close approximation of the word is a skill that all skilled readers have, even if they were never taught by phonics. How do we know that? Because kids that were never taught by a phonic approach that became skilled readers can sound out nonsense words. How can you possibly sound out nonsense words you've never seen before, other than the fact that you have the phonemic decoding skills to do so? So the issue isn't, are phonics skills important? They are. They're essential. Find a skilled reader who cannot sound out simple nonsense words. And I know of laboratories around the world that would love to study that kid because we have not found him or her yet, at least a skilled reader beyond third grade. You can kind of fudge your way through it in kindergarten, first grade with visual memorization, et cetera. But once you start getting to that about third grade level, you have this explosion of vocabulary. Too many words in English look too similar to too many other words. It doesn't work. So the phonemic decoding skills, as we'll call them, are essential for reading an alphabet-based writing system. They're not optional. The question becomes, why don't we teach it then? Why do we try to let kids figure it out on their own? That's another issue. So then remembering words. You can actually become good at sounding out words and not be good at remembering words. That's what dyslexics and languages like Italian and Spanish, that's the kind of presentation dyslexia has there. They have a much more regular system of writing. So as a result, it takes them longer to learn the code, but they eventually do learn the code, most of them. But now they don't build a large vocabulary of words, so they find themselves having to sound out the same words over and over and over again. So fluency is the major characteristic in those consistent language or orthographies, those written language systems. In English, because we have more irregularities than any other alphabetic writing system, we have problems with fluency for our poor readers, but also accuracy. So those are the two key skills. Now, this may not be obvious, but the second one is largely dependent on the first, but having the first skill is not enough. Let me give you an illustration. I apologize ahead of time for my laziness by using such an old reference, but I happened to come across it anecdotally. I read this many years ago and then fished it out not too long ago. And started using it. But this represents the interrelationship between the ability to sound out words, unfamiliar words, and the ability to remember words. So these researchers, one of which, by the way, Goff, the first one, Philip Goff, he and William Tunmer were the ones that first come up with the simple view of reading. Well, Goff and Walsh gave children 40 nonsense words. These are experimenter designed nonsense words, pronounceable non-words like blat or prup. And then they gave them exception words, the words that if you sound them out, you're going to be wrong. So either you know them or you don't. Those would be words like iron, yacht, rendezvous, etc. Now look what they found with these children. They found that the children that weren't good at remembering words, meaning they didn't remember some of these exception words and hadn't had them stored in memory, they were not very good at sounding out words. The children that were very good at sounding out words were the ones that were remembering more of the words. Then you have a third group of children who actually were pretty good at sounding out words, but they didn't seem to be good at remembering words. Now, of course, we're inferring this memory process based upon how much these kids have accumulated up until that point. But look what's missing. This whole quadrant is missing. We don't have individuals who are really good at remembering words, but they haven't mastered the code. All right. So again, you can kind of fake your way through in kindergarten into first grade. Maybe if you're really bright, we'll talk about compensators later, kind of create that impression in the second grade, but then it starts falling apart after that. So one is dependent on the other, but as you'll see, the ability, that first level of sounding out where phonics shines, phonics skills shine, that first level doesn't guarantee that you're going to be good at remembering words, because we're going to talk about how we remember words, and that's important. And it's something that we need to evaluate the skills that go into that. And as you'll see, I'm leading to the WIAT-4 has some very useful subtests for that. So here's a question that needs a scientific answer. If we adults that are educated and we read have between 20,000 and 70,000 words in our orthographic lexicon. By the way, orthographic lexicon is just a fancy term for that data bank of familiar words that jump out at us instantly. We don't have to put any effort into it whatsoever. It's also referred to in education as a sight word vocabulary. But unfortunately, the term sight word gets used in 3 different ways in education, and that can be confusing. It gets used for high frequency words. It gets used for irregular words. Well, researchers are a bit more precise. They refer to irregular words as irregular words or exception words. They refer to high frequency words as high frequency words. So you can have a high frequency word that's irregular or one that's irregular. And you could do a 2x2 table, 4 different concepts, and to blend them together with the same term is very confusing. I strongly encourage people to not use the word sight word for high frequency words. Call them high frequency words, common words, Dolch words, fry words, whatever. And the same thing for irregular words. Call them irregular words, exception words, tricky words, not heart words. Well, you could use that term, rule breakers, whatever you want. But a third use is a word that you're familiar with, that jumps out at you instantaneously, a word in your orthographic lexicon, a word in your sight vocabulary. That is how I will use the term sight word, and that's how researchers that study orthographic learning. Orthographic learning is the study of how we remember the words we read, because we're not sounding them all out as we go along. We only sound out a new and unfamiliar word. So I want you to think about this. Let's just say for the rest of today, the presentation, that on average, we have a 50,000 word sight vocabulary. So of the 50,000 words that are stored away in your long-term memory, what percentage of them do you think when you first came across them, did you put conscious effort into remembering it for the future? Now, I can't get a show of hands, obviously, or I can't get a response. But if you're like most people, you're going to say, wow, very few. Think about it. When you came across a new word, whether it was 2nd grade, 5th grade, 7th grade, during your college years, 3 weeks ago when it was some technical term you hadn't seen before, did you run and get the flashcards? Did you cover it up and try to memorize it? No. What's amazing about orthographic learning is that it is implicit. It's happening automatically, unconsciously, and behind the scenes. Compare that to a lot of other learning we've done over the years. Think about when you had to learn your math facts. Think about in high school when you took a second language. Think about when you had to memorize all the biology terms or chemistry terms, et cetera, et cetera. Here in the United States, when we had to learn state capitals, think about how many times that was not implicit learning. That just didn't happen automatically in the background. But yet orthographic learning is amazing in the sense that we see it a couple of times, and then it's embedded within our long-term memory. And once we learn it, we don't forget. When was the last time you saw a word that you've known for years and you're like, oh, what was that again? I can't remember. It doesn't work like that. Orthographic memory is pretty amazing. So the area of orthographic learning is the study of how that happens. And I'll let you in on a little bit about that today. So we require an explanation. We require an explanation for why it is it took so much effort for us to memorize those math facts, and yet remembering words. Incidentally, research has shown that children from 2nd grade on that are on target for learning to read require only 1 to 4 exposures to new words for them to remember it. That's it, 1 to 4 exposures. Now that may sound surprising because many of you listening, like me, your career experience. Oh, by the way, yeah, I was a school psychologist. I'm not working in that capacity now, but I was a school psychologist for 28 years, and I've been teaching at the university for 26 years. What I wasn't mentioned is those two overlapped. I'm not 78, okay? I may feel it, but I'm not actually that old. But anyway, those of us that worked in schools, that's not the children that we work with. The children that we work with see those same words over and over and over and don't remember them. But if you look at the growth trajectory from children, say, entering kindergarten, entering 1st grade, and they know 100 to 500 words, then you check back on those kids 2 years later as they enter 3rd grade and they know a few thousand words, do the math. There's no way they saw all those 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 words 18, 25 times, other than the high frequency words. No, 1 to 4 exposures, folks, and we have a lot of research to support that. So we have children that are taking so long to remember these words. That's a key indicator that there's a problem in the second level of word reading. That is the ability to remember words, even if they become good at sounding out words. If it's taking them from second grade on, if it's taking them many, many, many exposures to remember a word, that's telling you there is a problem with the orthographic learning. All right, how do we remember words then? Orthographic mapping is a specific theory within the orthographic learning research that was thought up in the late 70s by Dr. Linnea, Ehri, E-H-R-I, and she came up with this idea, and throughout the 80s, she did some experimental studies on it, and all the research sort of supported her theory. But it wasn't until the 90s that independent researchers started studying it into the early 2000s. And the results were so consistent, whether she studied it, whether independent people studied it independently, that there's been very little research on it in the last 10 to 15 years, hardly any at all. Direct, that is. Much indirect research supports it. It's kind of like you don't see too many studies of the connection between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, right? They've come to some conclusions and moved on. So this is a very well-established understanding of how we remember words. So orthographic mapping is the process we use to remember words for instant recall later on down the line. And this applies to word parts, not just words. And so this has taken on its own little separate thing in some quarters where like orthographic memory, IGHT, I remember that as an orthographic unit. Well, it's very well accounted for within Ehri's orthographic mapping theory. She has another very closely related theory which talks about the development of the skill of orthographic mapping. And those are the 4 phases. You can Google that. And you'll if you type in Ehri's theory, you're probably going to see something to that effect. And it's really a theory of the development of the ability to become efficient at orthographic mapping and storing words, where the orthographic mapping theory per se describes the mechanism of how it happens once that skill is developed. So it's also parts of words. So studies have been done where children from second grade on that are skilled readers, they see a nonsense word like N-A-L-K and they say knock. But if kids that are in first grade or weak second grade readers will look at it and say nelk. So what's happened is, and I'm giving you the shorthand version of it, we have plenty of research to show that when we remember a word like walk or talk, not only is the W-A-L-K or T-A-L-K being implicitly stored in our long-term memory, that pronounceable unit awk is also being stored in there. And of course, there's also AWK like in the word hawk, but the point is that, they both, awk is in our phonological memory, sounds, but in our orthographic memory, there's at least 2 versions of it, ALK and AWK. So it's parts of words that get stored just as well. And this comes in very handy as kids develop and they start dealing with multisyllabic words. The ability to remember multisyllabic words after only a couple of exposures, this goes a long way to help us understand that process. So orthographic mapping is the mechanism that actually builds the sight vocabulary. And other than visual input of the letters, the visual memory process is extremely limited. Our intuition, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, but our intuition is that visual memory is how we remember words. And it turns out not to be the case. Here's some basic visual skills we need to read. Number 1, you need visual discrimination. You need to be able to look at a lowercase t and a lowercase f, and the only difference might be the little teeny hook at the top. And if kids can distinguish between the 2 of them, now they can label them. But if they can't distinguish them, any labels are going to get all muddied up and problematic. And so visual discrimination is important, number 1, and visual recognition. So maybe a child, you can show a child those 2 letters I just described, a preschooler, and say, have you seen, are these different? And the child says, yes. So they have visual discrimination. But then if you take them away and come back a couple of days later, and if you show them a lowercase f, or you show them some alphabetic looking character that's really not an actual alphabetic character, and you say to the second one, you say, have you seen this before? And the kid's gonna be like, no. And then you show them the lowercase f, and they go, yeah, I've seen it before. Visual recognition. So once you have those basic skills, you have the building blocks for reading. That involves paired associate learning. So you have to drill it into the kids. They got to know that that's the letter F and it says, that's the letter T and it says T, and all the other letters need to be learned through and many, many, many exposures. Notice how different that is from orthographic learning. So kids require dozens to hundreds of exposure to the letters to remember them. Paired associate learning between that visual prompt, that letter, and the phonological retrieval, the sound that it makes, or even the letter's name. Compare that to orthographic learning, a series of those letters, 1 to 4 exposures. That's it. The very different kind of learning, orthographic learning, paired associate learning. It's not a visual memory process. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So you have broadly speaking, two cognitive theories. When I say cognitive, 2 clarifications. Number 1, I mean in contrast to computational modeling. There are several different computational modeling approaches where computer programs are trying to mimic how reading learns. They give us lots of insight into the reading process, but for many of them, it still takes hundreds of exposures for the word to become mapped. We know from working with real children, it's really 1 to 4 exposures. So I'm just going to set those aside. A great description of that and a great book to follow up on, by the way, is Mark Seidenberg's Language at the Speed of Sight. He has a whole chapter in that on computational modeling, as well as a lot of other really good stuff that provides background on the reading research. Anyway, the second qualification to the term cognitive is in school psychology. We often use the term cognitive to refer to certain types of like cognitive tests and cognitive theories of that sort. I'm thinking, harken back to your intro psych, or if you took a cognitive psych course in undergrad, we're talking about just the whole memory system, not about cognitive assessments here. So that's what I mean by cognitive approach. So 2 basic cognitive theories of how we remember words. Both of them fit together hand in glove, but each contributes a different piece, or each of them contribute different pieces to the bigger picture. So David Scher's self-teaching hypothesis begins with the insight that of the 50,000 words we know, how many of them did our teachers teach us and our parents teach us? Several hundred, right? Maybe 1,000, maybe even 2,000 words. I doubt it, but let's say if our teachers in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade taught us 2,000 words. Who taught us the other 48,000? Well, we taught ourselves. That's why it's called the self-teaching hypothesis. Now, just so you know, that assumes that you are good at sounding out words, as you'll see in a moment. So don't think self-teaching means you teach yourself the alphabet, you teach yourself how to sound out words. No. Once you're good at that, where the self-teaching mechanism allows us to accurately sound out words, context resolves any ambiguity, and then after 1 or 2 exposures, 1 to 4 exposures of that new word, it gets added to our sight vocabulary. So that's what the self-teaching hypothesis is. Interestingly, when they've done studies to disrupt the possibility for a child to sound out a new word, the ability to remember it drops off dramatically. So one of the things that two of the major contributions of Scher's self-teaching hypothesis is the context in which we learn most words, which is real reading. That's how we learn the 48,000 words that our teachers never taught us when we encounter it in print. And secondly, that you have to be able to sound it out. So here you see a manner in which the first of the 2 levels of word reading, the phonetic decoding or phonemic decoding, is essential for remembering words because you have to be able to accurately sound it out. The other reason why they're similar is they both involve sounds and they both involve that letter knowledge, right? Okay, so as I told you, from 2nd grade on, typically developing readers, numerous empirical studies. Again, many of us who are listening or participating in this, we're not used to that kid, but think about the kids that are typically developing readers. They really pick up on this stuff. One group of researchers referred to it as the sponge-like acquisition of written words. Then one of the things that Scher's theory doesn't explain is what is it about sounding out that word that allows us to make the connection to remember it for the next time. He doesn't get that explicit. In fact, in one of his theoretical papers from 2011, he refers to that process as a black box. Well, Ehri's theory has more or less tried to open up that black box and talk about the actual memory mechanism that's going on. Ehri explains that sight words, now here I'm using the term in the way that it's used in orthographic learning, which is it doesn't matter if it's high frequency or low frequency. It doesn't matter if it's phonetically regular or irregular. The property of a sight word is whether or not it's stored already and you can instantly retrieve. That is a characteristic of a sight word. There's nothing inherent of a written word that makes it a sight word. It's only if it's made it into the long-term memory for instant retrieval, then it's considered a sight word. So look at all the different presentations of the word bear. They're very different visually, aren't they? And as long as they're legible, I mean, some of those letters are not going to be legible to the average first grader. I mean, look at the R in the second to the last version of bear. I mean, is that an R? Is it a V? Is it an I? So the idea is that the letter has to be legible. Now, one of the important things that we've learned in this connection is that each letter, as children learn to read, each letter becomes a category in the knowledge system. That's no different than any other aspect of our memory system from infancy on. From infancy on, we start building categorical knowledge of chairs. Chairs look very different from one another, but they have certain features, so I know it's a chair. We have, any lamps, cats. Any type of concepts that we learn, we see that there are different variations, but we still identify it as such. And so what happens when children learn to read, they realize that R can be presented in different ways. The uppercase R and the lowercase R look nothing alike. And in fact, look at the uppercase version of bear and the lowercase version of bear. There is no visual similarity at all, other than that there are 4 characters, because the uppercase and lowercase version look different from each other. This is one of the many things I mean when I say it's not about visual memory. So a child could learn the word bear in lowercase in first grade as reading a children's story, and then for the very first time in second grade be reading a comic strip and see the all caps in the word bear and instantly recognize it as familiar, even though they've never seen that visual display before. They've never seen bear in uppercase before, so they're not recalling a visual memory. They're recalling an orthographic memory. So let me unpack that word orthographic a little bit here. It's from 2 Greek words. I'm focusing on the original meaning in classical Greek, but orthos means straight or correct, like an orthodontist straightens your teeth. And graphos has come in our English adaptation to mean like a drawing. But in classical Greek, it originally meant like scratches of lines that eventually it was meant to refer to letters of their alphabetic writing system. So orthographic means the correct order, the correct order of writing. So orthographic memory is that we remember a letter order as familiar. So whether it's bear in lowercase or uppercase, even though they're visually very distinct from one another, it's still memorable. That's orthographic memory. Visual memory would be you learn bear in lowercase, you see bear in uppercase, you're like, I have no idea what that is. Can somebody tell me what that is? Or I got to sound it out or whatever. And of course, in bear, it would be tough to sound out because it would be beer, wouldn't it? So sight words are anchored through a connection forming process. The idea, another element that goes back to infancy, is that we learn things new most easily if we can connect it to something that's already stored in our long-term memory. And that's what's going on here. What's stored in the long-term memory? The oral pronunciation. So a child encounters a printed word red, R-E-D, for the first time. Now, in their long-term memory, in all likelihood, they already have heard that. They've heard the word red. And so there's something in their long-term memory that is now an anchoring point. So if they can connect the visual 3 letters to that pronunciation, they will anchor that in their long-term memory system for later retrieval. So it kind of looks like this. So PLTM refers to phonological long-term memory. And if you see slash marks on either side of a letter, that refers to the sound the letter makes, not the letter itself. So I'm cheating a little bit and I'm using that for a whole word. So that's the pronounced word red. That's not the written word red. And it's in your phonological long-term memory. And a child comes across this for the very first time, this printed word. And their mind is ready, their memory system is ready to store that if they can pull it apart at the phoneme level. That's where phoneme awareness comes in. Now, as you'll see momentarily, phoneme awareness isn't enough. Phoneme proficiency is needed, but phoneme awareness is a step. Just like in normal, accuracy precedes automaticity. So a child now has anchoring points in the long-term memory. But if the child doesn't have phoneme awareness and they can't pull apart the sounds in red, they really don't have something to anchor this to. But if they do have it, look what they can do. You get a word like has. The child sees it. Okay, that might seem a little strange because you expect a Z at the end, but hey, a lot of words that end in S make a Z sound, don't they? So here's how share and Ehri work together. You get the word drift. If you have letter sound knowledge, look what you can do. you can sound it out. Now, if any of you have ever worked with a child that would go and then look at you like, what's the word? You're like, what's the word? You just sounded it out. That child has a problem with blending. So, whoops. So if they are good at blending, look what they can do. They can activate the spoken word. Oh, drift. There we go. Good. But then here's what's happening. Once the child knows the word, see, orthographic mapping can't happen until you know what the word is you're looking at. Phonetic decoding is involved when you don't know what the word is. But once you know what the word is, you can connect that pronunciation that you now know happens to be represented by that word to its individual components at the phoneme level. So look what happens. The phoneme awareness or analysis allows them to anchor that to the spoken form, from the spoken form, excuse me, to the written form. Now, those are words that are transparent, meaning there's a one-to-one correspondence. But opaque are words there's not a one-to-one correspondence. You look at make. Uh-oh, we have a little bit of a difficulty here because I hear 3 sounds, but there are 4 letters. So what you do is you anchor to those, and hopefully, we don't have research this specific, but I'm going to go on a limb a little bit and say that I think knowing the silent E rule probably helps with the mapping as well. It certainly helps with sounding out the word. And then you have read. And now you have a different problem. In the first case, you need to make an adjustment. In the second case, you need to make a different kind of adjustment. Both of these are phonetically regular words, and we still need to make an adjustment for the mapping process to connect the pronunciation to the print. Now, look at an irregular word. You got comb. You have to make the same adjustment as with a silent E word, like in make, because you have a silent B. Now, silent B isn't a typical rule. Yeah, there are a bunch of MB words, but not enough to create a whole rule. It is a pattern, though. So you have to make an adjustment. And so irregular words are not a huge problem for mapping like they are for sounding out words. Most irregular words are only off by a single element. There are very few that aren't. And they... The big difference is with phonetic decoding, you don't know what the word is. And the letters are not giving you accurate information. So with mapping, you already know what the word is. So you have the cheat sheet and you're able to connect that. So Ehri says exception words are only exceptional when someone tries to read them by applying a phonetic decoding strategy. When they are learned as sight words, they are secured in memory by the same connections as regularly spelled words. So we routinely have to make adjustments to regular words, just like we do to irregular words. As you see, silent E words, vowel digraphs that are regular, we have to adjust them. Then multisyllabic words where there's a vowel reduction in the non-stressed syllable, etc. Okay, so the issue of irregular words does not prevent kids from becoming good readers in English as long as they have the phonological skills to weather those speed bumps. But children that have poor phonological skills aren't able to do that. So orthographic mapping requires this. Now I'm looking and I know I had a late start. By the way, the folks putting this on were not responsible for our late start. That was me, 100%. I'm sorry about that. And anyway, but I do want to mention this. This here represents the most significant slide from a theoretical perspective that's going to lead to why we do what we do in terms of assessing kids, like on the WIAT-4 subtest. So orthographic mapping requires 2 things, letter sound proficiency and phonemic proficiency. Not letter sound knowledge. That's a step toward proficiency. Let me tell you an example of letter sound knowledge. Some of you will know this if you've done universal screenings. It's certainly plenty of research to show. But children at the end of 1st grade, you give them a CVC nonsense word like MIP, and they say MIP instantly. That means the child retrieved the sound for the M, the sound for the I, the sound for the P, and blended them together all in 1 second. And not only retrieved the right sounds, retrieved the right sound for the I. They didn't say MIPE, but had it been MIPE, they would have said MIPE instantly and not MIP. So that's pretty amazing. What that means is the child has automatized that whole process. That's letter sound proficiency. Another child at the end of 1st grade looks at MIP and says, MIP. Well, they're already half a school year behind. But what do they have? They have letter sound knowledge, but they're still behind. So letter sound knowledge is not enough. Letter sound knowledge will get you into that lower right quadrant. Remember those kids that were good at sounding out words but weren't good at remembering words? Letter sound knowledge will get you there. But you need letter sound proficiency for that's automatic access for the orthographic mapping. Okay, phonemic proficiency. Now with phonemic proficiency, you're going to see on the WIAT-4, you're going to see some phonemic manipulation tasks. And you're going to understand why phonemic manipulation is so useful. In fact, in the reading research, it's been years since I've seen studies. It's pretty rare. They may still be out there where they actually use a phonological segmentation task. Because reading researchers learned a long time ago that phonological segmentation does not correlate with reading as well as phonological deletion or substitution tasks. And you're about to learn why. You have a child, you're going to start out on the WIAT-4 with simple things like say sailboat, but don't say sail. And you work your way up to some of the harder items. And let's say if you say sky, sky. Now say it again instead of say a little sly. Skilled readers are going to come back that fast. That means in 1 second, they did 4 classic phonemic tasks. They did segmentation. They pulled it sky apart into its components. Then they did phoneme isolation. Those of you familiar with the CTOP, you know there's now a phoneme isolation subtest on there. That's where am I hearing the sound? Beginning, middle, and end. Oh, there it is in the middle. Then phoneme manipulation, you change the k to a l, and then you do phoneme blending because now you have a different order of sounds and you have to blend those together. So that's 4 classic phonemic tasks in 1 second. Here's the difference between task and skill, which I'll elaborate on more in a few minutes. But those 4 tasks are helping us get at one skill. The skill is phonemic proficiency. You see, I'm betting that if that kid responds in 1 second and did 4 classic tasks in 1 second, on average, that's 1/4 of a second per task. I mean, we don't know how much is allotted to each one of those 4, but on average, only 1/4 of a second. That suggests to me that access to the phonemic structure is automatic. But if you do a segmentation task and say to the child, tell me all the sounds in sky, they can actually track through it without those sounds popping into their head. In the first case, the segmented version of that must have popped into their head automatically, or they wouldn't have been able to respond as quickly as they do and do the next 3 things. But if a child is doing a segmentation task, they can actually track through the word as if you were to say to them, I want you to tell me all the numbers from 1 to 5 as fast as you can, go. Chances are the 1 to 5 didn't pop in their head, but they're computing their way through it. Okay, so as a result, phoneme segmentation tasks cannot get at the phoneme proficiency. It's a conscious task. The proficiency is automatic and unconscious, but a segmentation task by its very nature is conscious. So how do we get at this unconscious process through a task that's consciously focusing on what you're trying to look at? So this helps answer the question I described earlier. How is it that we can store words instantly, effortlessly, and in the background? Here it is. I want you to think about this logic for a minute, folks. If the process of storing words is automatic and unconscious and goes on behind the scenes, that means that any skills that are required for that process, and these are 2 skills that Ehri says are required for that process, they have to be automatic and unconscious and behind the scenes. So that is going to affect how we think about reading and how we think about teaching reading, but also how we evaluate reading. And you'll see that we have some subtests on the, I say we, okay, I guess I'm trying to, buddy up to the WISC-4 people or WIAT-4 people a little bit here, but I guess we collectively as a community of school psychologists and educational evaluators have on the WIAT-4 subtests that are going to get at these, which is really exciting. The key to reading fluency appears to be the sight vocabulary size. The reading panel did not discuss this because this had not been thought up theoretically yet and really discussed. It wasn't until after the reading panel that Torgerson and colleagues down at Florida State University, one of the funding hubs for the NICHD, where they started putting out a bunch of papers saying, you know what? The size of the sight vocabulary, the size of the orthographic lexicon is determined by numerous things, but probably the lion's share goes to the size of the sight vocabulary, because if we have a large sight vocabulary, we're going to move through text pretty easily. Words are popping out at us quickly and accurately. But if we have a limited sight vocabulary, we're going to plod through very slowly, and we're going to be inaccurate, and it's going to slow us down. Now, there's actually evidence, and some of you may go, wait a minute, isn't RAN, rapid automatized naming, a part of fluency? How about reading experience? Both of them are, and Torgerson and colleagues would be quick to acknowledge that. But rapid and automatized naming and reading experience also correlate with the size of the sight vocabulary. So we can't tease those apart all that simply. And we can't directly correct rapid and automatized naming. And we have no control over kids' reading experience when they leave school, but we can build the skills necessary to become good at building that sight vocabulary. Now, there is evidence in the correlation tables, as I spent a few hours in the WIAT-4 correlation tables since they sent me my test. And when you look at the oral reading fluency and compare that to the orthographic fluency is all words that you read words, and the third grade and higher version of it, every word is phonetically irregular. So either you know it or you don't, and it's timed. So based on some comments from some researchers, this is really the best way to get at estimating the size of the sight vocabulary. Not estimating in terms of actual number of words you know, but estimating relative to a norm group. Are you above most kids? Are you similar to most kids or below most kids? So look at the correlations between that test of the size of the sight vocabulary, which is a timed word reading list, no context, word reading list with all irregular words. First and second grade, mostly irregular words. The first couple of words are regular though. And look at the correlation. There you have age 4 to 7, age 8 to 11, age 12 to 50. The correlation between that task and oral reading fluency, look how high, right? So this really supports Torgerson and Notion. There's other support for it as well, but I thought I'd take it right off the WIAT-4. So the key skills that we need for reading, I'm going to really race through this because I'm running, I've only got a little over half an hour and I want to get through a lot of this. But to become good at phonemic decoding, all that lower right corner, remember that lower right corner of the scatter plot? You need letter sound knowledge and you need to be able to blend phonemes together. That's it. And then you can sound out all kinds of words. But that doesn't mean you're going to remember words, because that word memory process, as I described earlier, is automatic. It's unconscious. It goes behind the scenes. So the skills needed to pull that off have to be automatic. So now you have to bump up to letter sound proficiency and phonemic proficiency. All right, I mentioned skills and tasks. Again, I'm going to kind of race through this. We have a lot of different phoneme tasks and phonological tasks in the research literature. You can divide phonological awareness, the classic description, into two broad categories: synthesis, which is putting sounds together to make a word, blending, which is blending, and analysis. Well, with synthesis, the one task that's used 99% of the time is a blending task. And the skill that you need to sound out a word and the task we use to get at that are very similar. So we get lulled to sleep because task and skill seem to correspond so well. But when it comes to pulling apart words, that's what the analysis is at the phonological level. Well, at the syllable level, first sound awareness, phoneme level. I counted over 24 different phonological analysis tasks used in the research literature. What are each of those telling us? Well, I think they're telling us the same thing, but some are doing a better job than others. The synthesis is telling us if a child puts sound to sound to sound as they track through a word, can they activate the word? That's what the synthesis is telling us. What is analysis telling us? Well, if we understand Ehri's theory, we know that it's telling us how we anchor words into long-term memory. So I just said this, didn't I, right? So there are many different phoneme tasks out there, but there's really only two skills. I had them for you on the earlier screen. You need to be able to blend words instantaneously, that automatic blending, that kid that sees MIP and says MIP instantly, and you have to have phoneme proficiency, meaning instant access. I didn't really do a good job of defining it earlier. Phoneme proficiency is the instant access to the phonemic structure of the spoken language without even thinking about it. So when those kids go from sky to sly instantly, they're not consciously tracking their way through the word sky. So they both play different roles in reading. You have phoneme blending is needed for phonemic decoding, and phoneme analysis is needed for remembering words. All those other tasks, we get into almost all the tests out there, they give you all these different tasks and then come up with a global score. What's it telling you? What the WIAT-4 is doing for the first time is working backward from what we know about how reading works. All the others because the phoneme skills are so important. Think about what I said at the beginning. We have a phoneme-based writing system. Phoneme skills are so important. It doesn't matter what phoneme task you throw at kids, it's going to correlate to some degree or another with reading, but some correlate more strongly than others. Now, before you think this is some crazy idea of mine, let's go back to 2000. And by the way, the section, the part of the reading panel on alphabetics, which covered phonemic awareness and phonics, was chaired by Linnea Ehri, interestingly. And so here's what the reading panel said. The skill of blending is needed to decode unfamiliar words. And segmenting, now they're talking about the skill here. They're not talking about a segmentation task. They're talking about the skill of segmenting helps children remember how to read words and spell words. So these aren't some crazy ideas of mine. These are very well established within the reading research and been around. I mean, that's 20 years ago as I'm recording this here. So when we have to distinguish between those. Like I said, there's a very easy correspondence between task and skill when it comes to blending. But when you get to the analysis side, we have, look at, there's 7 categories. I grouped 2 together just to fit them on the PowerPoint. Categorization and identification are actually different, but there's 7 different categories under which there are different subtasks, 24 different tasks that we use. And we have to realize that it's only one skill. They're all tapping into one skill. Some are doing a better job than others. Let's see if there's anything else I need to say about that, because I want to get through. The reason I don't use the term phoneme segmentation proficiency is I'm trying to avoid the word segmentation, because even though Ehri in all of her descriptions and all the research surrounding her theory, they talk about segmentation, they're talking about a skill going on between your ears. A task is not a skill going on between your ears. A task is something we see you do and we do with you, and we see you respond. I avoid the word segmentation because people, oh yeah, we have a segmentation task. No. Another term that I've used, and I'm steering away from it, is the term advanced phonemic awareness. And the reason I'm the original reason for that term, advanced, was because by the end of first grade, typically developing readers, they can segment and blend just about any word you give them, but they don't have the proficiency yet that a third grader has that allows that sight word explosion in third grade. So they don't have the proficiency for the very highly efficient orthographic mapping yet. So advanced to me meant the phonemic awareness that grows after first grade. So what's growing? The proficiency is what's growing. Now, some people have confused advanced phonemic awareness with the skill, the task that we use to get at that, which is manipulation tasks like deletion and substitution. Okay, those are 2 different categories. Okay, advanced phonemic awareness is a skill. It goes on between your ears. Phonemic manipulation tasks are a task. And yes, they allow us, especially if there's a timed element, they allow us to get at that skill much better than other tasks. So I'm getting away from that because people have conflated a little bit. So as I said, segmentation, they're referring to a skill there. All right, have I beaten this to death pretty much? Yeah, okay, you kind of get the idea. So segmentation is a conscious task. We're trying to get at an unconscious process, but you're using a conscious focus on that process, and that's problematic. So think about it. When we do that segmentation, going from sky to sly, we're sneaking up on the segmentation. And we know it's happening in, on average, roughly speaking, a quarter of a second. Look at the difference in terms of the research literature. Segmentation tasks correlate with reading 0.3 to 0.5, and that's like kindergarten, first grade, folks. It even drops off after that. And then manipulation tasks correlate 0.5 to 0.8. And on the WIAT-4, the correlation of 0.5 or higher is maintained in all the word reading subtests K-12. So that's telling you that there's an important factor of this phonemic proficiency. It's not just, it's so easy for people to dismiss phonemic awareness because most kids can do it at the end of first grade. And then here's the tricky part. Many, not all, but many struggling readers will figure it out or be taught it and get it by the end of second grade. They're already a year behind. And by second grade, they're struggling. And we test their segmentation. They can do it. And we think they have enough phonemic awareness. No, they don't. They have enough phonemic awareness for phonetic decoding. They don't have enough phonemic awareness for orthographic learning. All right, why do some kids struggle? There's this term dyslexia. Some researchers use it, some don't. But for years, what's called the phonological core deficit was referred to as the most common cause. And in 2012, a review of research on this said it was a universal cause. And these weren't just a bunch of hacks with a strange idea out at the periphery. These were folks at Florida State University, which is, as I said, one of the funding hubs for the NICHD for this kind of research. The reason why they shifted from calling it the most common cause, which seems to leave open the door for a lot of other possibilities, and the universal cause is twofold. Number one, here are the phonological core deficit items. Children who have poor word reading do not get a clean bill of health on all 5 of these items. Kids that are good at reading get a clean bill of health on all 5 of these items. That's the first reason. Second reason is for the last 40 or 50 years, researchers have been studying lots of alternative explanations to dyslexia, and nothing's turning up. That's what you see in their quote above. They say, you know, although some individuals would have weaknesses in a variety of areas, impaired phonological processing appears to be a universal cause. So what we don't see are any alternatives that give us very powerful explanations for why children are struggling in reading, other than obvious things, lack of opportunity, etc. And this shouldn't be surprising, given that we have a phoneme-based writing system that difficulties with. The prevention research, I'm going to go through very quickly. Just basically that when children are trained in kindergarten and or first grade with phonological awareness or phonics, the results with phonics were similar, there was a really big improvement, but that kind of shrunk, the gap shrunk a couple of years later. And the reason is that most children, because these were general populations, most children figured it out eventually, even though they weren't taught this. But not with the at-risk kids. With the at-risk kids, there was a much larger difference between those who got whole class, this is tier 1, whole class phonemic awareness instruction, and those that didn't. And then with time, the gap did not shrink, it actually expanded. So this shows you the power of developing these phonemic skills for children and the impact it has on reading. And then also for intervention, I've kind of talked about this, and I don't have a website, I don't have any videos that I have, but others have recorded stuff. You can, I go into more depth on others. If you want to find some of those, the Reading League or Colorado Department of Education has these and a few others. Anyway, it should be no surprise, phonemic awareness and letter sound knowledge are important in tier 1. Intervention, there's a pattern in the intervention literature. If we look at standard score point gains on word reading tests, we find very limited gains if you don't do any phonics at all, or if you do phonics with no phonemic awareness, additional oral phonemic awareness. And then if you do oral phonemic awareness, but only do up to segmentation. Remember I talked about segmentation being an ending first grade level skill. If you leave it at that, you get better results, but you don't get the best results. The best results have come when folks have aggressively went after and directed those issues that resulted in what I consider to be phonemic proficiency, and you saw much larger standard score point gains. And the follow-up, interestingly, the follow-up studies, that these results are maintained over time. But some of those others in that first group, they may gain only 3 or 4 standard score points and come back a year later and lose even that. So the interesting thing is this is consistent with orthographic learning theory, okay? That when you provided kids with the elements they need for the orthographic mapping, they did much better. Okay, let's talk about assessment. I think I did spend a lot of time giving you the background, giving you the theory, but that is going to drive our assessment. And one of the things we have to get past early on is our conventional word identification tasks. All the major batteries have one. The WIAT has had one since its first edition. The Woodcock-Johnson, the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test, the RAT, the KTEA, they all have it. But what they are is they're functionally untimed. Now, some of them may say move on after 3 seconds or 5 seconds. That's all the time in the world, by the way. If you know it, it's instant. If you don't know it, 3 seconds of phonetic decoding is all you would need. Here's the problem with those tasks. They conflate 3 different skills. Now, granted, we want to keep them because they form like an anchoring point in the history of reading assessment and reading research, because it's still the most common test use of reading in all the reading research studies is a traditional word identification test. So in these tests, some of the words you know already and you instantly recognize them. Some of them you don't know, but through phonemic decoding, you sound them out. And third is you use set for variability. Now, set for variability has gotten much more recent research. It's the ability to properly identify a mispronounced word. So if you've ever tested a child, and say if it's the word laugh, and the child's out starting it out, and there's no context for them to use. So they go, low, low, laugh. And you're like, wow, where'd that come from? Okay. They use set for variability. So they tried to sound something out, but they were, they got at least close enough to something in their oral vocabulary that allowed them to trip it. Now, as it turns out, kids with higher vocabulary are better at this. So these tests are biased against, this is odd to put it this way because you'd think 4, they're actually biased against kids with high vocabularies because they will get artificially higher scores. You could have 2 kids that know the same words going into the test. They know the exact same words, and they have the exact same phonemic decoding ability. Let's say they both get an 81 on the word attack or the phonetic decoding test, and nonsense word decoding, so they have the same basic reading skills, but one has 113 verbal IQ and the other has an 89. So the kid with the, even though they have identical reading abilities, the child with the very high verbal IQ is going to figure out more words on that test. And whereas the kid with the 89 might pull a 83 on the word reading test, that child with the 113 might pull a 91, and we say, or 95, and they say, oh, they're fine. No, they have the exact same reading skills, but the other one was able to use a test-taking strategy, so to speak, to mask that. That's what compensators do. So good news is we have closed that loophole on the WIAT-4, as you'll see coming up. So the goal of our assessment should be to determine why a child struggles. And if you have a test that conflates 3 different skills, you're not going to be able to narrow it down. But we have ways of narrowing it down now. All right. Let's see here. Oh, boy. This, we're going to have to move beyond this. It's just going to take too long. Oh, what happened there? So basically, there's 2 different things. We have familiar words. We access the orthographic lexicon. If it's an unfamiliar word, a series of things kick in. And you see that. I don't have time to go in just because I want to talk more about the tests. All right. So the goal is to measure each reading-related skill that we can. Set for variability, we don't have a test quite yet for that, but our proxy for set for variability right now, given the limited research we have, we only have several studies. Is vocabulary. So looking at a child's vocabulary, if you can get that from somewhere else, the listening comprehension test is going to give you a little bit of a hint in that direction, but a vocabulary test is going to roughly be a proxy for set for variability until someone comes out with a set for variability test, which, by the way, I think would be a fairly easy test to do, but we don't have it right now. It's only experimenter designed. So for letter sound knowledge, we have the pseudo word reading subtest, and we've had that on the WIAT since I think the 2nd edition. I, by the way, am a user of the original WIAT. I've been at this a long time, and then the original KTEA, by the way, and then the letter sound proficiency. You have the decoding fluency. So this is important because now you have normed on the same kids a functionally untimed pseudo word reading test and a timed pseudo word reading test. That's the decoding fluency. You have a similar breakdown, by the way, on the KTEA-3. But they're administered a little differently in terms of the amount of time you have available, et cetera, et cetera. So now you have letter sound knowledge is going to tell you, can the child sound out words? And that's very important. Letter sound proficiency is going to help you know, have they ramped it up? To what degree have they ramped it up? And if you see a child, given that these are normed in the same kids, you see a child where there's a gap between these two, that's a very useful bit of information because that's telling you that, yeah, they can do the skills, but they don't have it enough in order to put it into practice in terms of remembering words. They have what they need to sound out words, but they don't necessarily have the level of proficiency for remembering words. So being able to look at and compare and go back and forth between these two. Now, granted, I got to believe that the vast majority of children are going to be very similar on one as they are on the other. Look at the correlation. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's pretty strong. But you are going to find children where there is a gap. And that is can be instructive in terms of letting you know where they are at developmentally and where maybe some of the efforts need to be directed in terms of instruction and intervention. Then phonemic proficiency. There are only 2 tests now that I know of that test phonemic proficiency, and that is the PASS, the Phonological Awareness Screening Test, which is free. And then there's but it's not normed. It's not normed. But the WIAT-4 is the first normed one I know about. Now, granted, we have on the universal screening batteries, we have timed phoneme tests, but the correlation with those drop off after first grade. That's why they take them off those tests. And if we think that all you need for skilled reading is the amount of phonemic awareness you have at the end of first grade, you're going to miss a huge portion of the whole, the underpinnings of how reading works. So phonemic proficiency is uses timed deletion and timed substitution subtests. And that allows us to get at how instant you can respond. There's a different scoring on that. If you get it correct, but it's not instant within the 2-second time frame, you get a 1. If you get it within a 2-second time frame, you get a 2. And so the child that's racked up a bunch of 2s versus the child that racked up a bunch of 1s, you're going to notice a difference in terms of their reading performance. And that shows up in the correlations, as I mentioned earlier. And so we also want to estimate the size of the orthographic lexicon. And the only other test that's been out there that I know of is the test of word reading efficiency, sight word efficiency. But on the orthographic fluency subtest, we've kind of gone one step beyond that. It's similar, but every single word is phonetically irregular. So either you know it or you don't. And the idea is that if you have to slow down to sound it out, you're not going to get as good of a score than if you happen to already know the words. So the now, does that aspect of having all the words irregular, does that make it better than the sight word efficiency? I have no idea. You have to put them side by side. I'd actually be quite surprised if it made a huge difference or even a significant difference. However, by building it in this way, you've already eliminated one possible explanation, is that the child was somehow able to figure them out phonetically. Because given the time limit and given the fact that they're all phonetically irregular, you're getting a nice, pure assessment of whether or not they know the words. And relative to other kids with large sight vocabularies are going to get a lot of words on this test, and kids with limited sight vocabulary are going to get a limited number of words on this test. So to talk about some specific subtests, the phonemic proficiency, it has blending built in. So questions I've gotten about the past is my version of McGinnis's version of Rosner and Simon 1971 Journal of Learning Disabilities. And you can get it free at thepasttest.com. It could be a nice adjunct to the phonemic proficiency, but the phonemic proficiency takes the past concepts and ramps it up because it's normed, which has always been a drawback to the past. So the questions I've gotten over years and years is people like, well, what about blending? Well, it's built in. If you say go from sky to sly, you have to blend to do that. If you say pat and change the p to a cat, you have to blend. So blending is naturally built in. The timing is critical. So there's a 2-second timing count. I'm not going to go into all the details on that. I'll let the folks at Pearson go into some of the administration details, and it's obviously in all the materials. But there's that timing element of whether or not the child responds quickly or not. And then you have, it's also important for the phonological core deficit. I have jokingly, because now thousands and thousands of people are using that free past test, the phonological awareness screening test. And so I've gotten hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of feedback on it and people's comments. And I have jokingly thought of changing it to calling it the eye-opener test. Because I've had so many people that have said, oh my gosh, I gave them to my middle school weak readers. I couldn't believe how much they struggled with it. And yet I gave it to my kid who's 6 years old. I gave it to my kid at home and he whizzed through it, no problem. Okay. So adding that timing element is giving you a key indicator of the phonological core deficit. Children that are typically developing readers develop the phonemic proficiency quite naturally as a matter of course. Children that with the phonological core deficit, we might be able to prop them up and get them to do basic segmentation, but it doesn't become automatic. So the phonemic proficiency subtest, I think, is a very good indicator. Now, I want to make a little side note. I don't want to get too far afloat here, but this and other subtests can help direct intervention. And that's my major goal, is to direct intervention. But at the same time, and this is a very fixable skill, by the way, the same time is when it comes to this and other things that aren't actually measured directly on the WIAT-4, like the rapid automatized naming, phonological working memory, those also provide evidence. Those are on the CTOP, they're on the new WISC, et cetera. those provide evidence if you are going in the direction of trying to designate a student as having a reading disability. Those provide evidence for that. But my bias is in the direction of saying, why is the child struggling? This happens to be very fixable. There are multiple programs out there that can help with that. And so it's also a key to spot the compensator. So the compensator is able to, they're very bright, and they're able to create the impression they're better readers than they are, and they're going to do poorly on the phonemic proficiency subtest. Compare a sixth grader that's a compensator with a second grader that's on target for learning to read that does not have nearly as high of a verbal IQ. Give me a kid with a 95 verbal IQ in second grade on target for learning to read, and a kid with 125 in sixth grade, and that second grader is going to run circles around them on this subtest. Another thing we have to do is get away from the idea with compensators is, well, as long as they get the meaning, that's what's important. No, these kids are struggling to get the meaning. It's very effortful. It doesn't have to be. It's a fixable problem if we can identify it. It doesn't have to be. And they don't like reading, and they avoid reading, and homework is a chore for them. And they could be among our best and brightest, and they're down in the principal's office for goofing around because they need to do something to keep themselves entertained during the school day, because reading isn't helping with that. As I said, thousands of people have already been using the past, so I've gotten a lot of feedback from that. More on specific subtests. The word reading naturally contains the confound, but there was a very conscious effort for keeping it on the test because you want to have something that corresponds to other similar ones on other batteries. And as I said, this has been the backbone. This type of task has been the backbone of the reading research. I would say without much hesitation that probably in English anyway, 90% of the research studies, when they take in the reading research, that take a measure of reading, use a classic word identification / word reading task like this. So I think, and it also provides a very good point of reference to the timed version. Like the untimed and timed nonsense word reading, the orthographic fluency is a good point of reference. If you have a child that gets a 96 on the word reading and gets an 86 on the orthographic fluency, that's telling you something. That's telling that that child is able to piece together what they need to correctly respond to the word reading test. But the orthographic fluency is telling you how many, giving you an estimate relative to peers about how large the orthographic lexicon is. You wouldn't be able to get that with the orthographic fluency test all by itself. At least you wouldn't be able to talk about how incremental it is. So if the child gets the 96 on the one and the 86 on the other, that's telling you, as I said earlier, accuracy precedes automaticity. And that's telling you something that's different from a child who gets 86 on both in terms of where that child's at. And so this will help identify compensators, this comparison between the two. I did this, by the way, for years. I used the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test Revised Word ID as an analog here to the word reading subtest on the WIAT-4, and the sight word efficiency subtest from the Tower as the analog to the orthographic fluency. And yes, most kids are going to be very similar within just a standard error measurement between the two, a large portion of them. But you do see suddenly a 7, 8, 9, 12, 15-point difference sometimes between them. And that's telling you something. That's telling you something about the skills. I talked about them now for the last hour, but it's telling you about the skills that go into efficient word level reading. The problem I had was these were normed on different populations. So if I saw a 7 or 8-point difference, I was going out on a limb if I said the skill was different because they were normed on different populations. But now you have these subtests on the WIAT-4 normed in the same population. And by the way, you have something roughly analogous, or I shouldn't say roughly analogous, pretty similar on the KTEA-3. Orthographic fluency, there's this elusive concept of orthographic processing. All the types of tasks that went into the quote-unquote orthographic processing task can be very comfortably explained and very well explained within the context of Ehri's two theories, her theory of how we remember words and her theory of how this memory skill develops, those two different, the developmental theory and the actual cognitive mechanism theory. This is why it's called orthographic fluency. Orthographic processing involves two different levels. One is specific knowledge of specific words, what this is getting at, and the other is more general orthographic patterns that kids develop, okay? And if you want to go something that route, you could do something like the test of orthographic fluency, or orthographic knowledge, I think. It has advantages, but not, hold on a minute. Let's see, add 30 minutes. There you go. I guess I've been talking too long. But quite frankly, it's a nice little periphery off to the side, but I'm not certain it's going to tell us too much more. It might tell us a little bit about those more general patterns. But that's not going right for the juggler. These tests are going right for the juggler in terms of where kids are at. Here we go. So to me, it's the most pure assessment. I said this earlier, the orthographic lexicon, because it's timed and all the words are irregular. And we have to get away from this idea that, like, oh, there's some kids that are just slower processors, like the words are in there, but they're just not coming out fast enough. That doesn't really have a parallel in the reading research. I think that's just an intuitive idea. If kids know the words, they come out pretty darn quick. The difference between coming out quick and not quick might be a 1/10 or 1/5 of a second, nothing that we would notice with our ears. So this is a very valuable test, okay? Processing speed subtests from the WIS don't really correlate very well with anything in reading, et cetera. And let's see, I'm really running out of time here, so I'm kind of going through this. Pseudo word decoding. I kind of covered it a little bit. It's going to be a good point of reference of pseudo word fluency, decoding fluency. Am I being redundant here? I'm not sure. So the key is you're looking at letter sound proficiency, and that's very important. And it's going to be a strong indicator. So if you have a child that does well on the pseudo word decoding, they may be doing well because they got good phonic intervention or instruction. But if they're not good in the decoding fluency, there are so many children that get good phonics instruction and they still are not good word readers. Some kids that get phonics instruction, that's all they need. They take off and live happily ever after. But that has to do with the severity of the phonological core deficit. The less severe cases, phonics is all they need. They take off. All the phonemic awareness they're going to need for orthographic mapping falls into place quite nicely. But for kids in the more moderate to severe case, it needs to be directly addressed and assessed. Spelling and orthographic choice, I don't have too much to say about that other than that they represent more or less expressive orthography. So spelling is a very good indicator of how well you know the orthography of a given word. The orthographic choice, you're basically looking at a few choices and determine which is the proper spelling. I think those all, and they do correlate, as you'll see, pretty well with the other tests. I apologize, I'm rushing through. Interpret, okay. I think you're going to have to tell me when to stop here, all right? But I just have a couple more slides. Some interpretive considerations. I kind of said this first bullet. I more or less mentioned that. Oh boy, I should have done that before we started. Sorry about that. Again, I think there's this naive notion. It's been around forever since I was in grad school in the mid 80s in my doctoral program in school psych. Just the idea is that we don't want to dismiss weak timed reading subtests as well. Some kids are just slower processors. That's the whole point, okay? That's the whole point of what we're calling dyslexia, poor word level reading, is that these children don't have automaticity, but we have the research to show that it can be developed. So let's not dismiss children of these timed subtests. We shouldn't be dismissive of them. We need to zero in on them and acknowledge them and recognize them, okay? All right, some of this should be pretty self-explanatory based on what I said. And I already told you the correlations with oral. Oh, I didn't with oral reading fluency. 0.4 and higher with the phonemic proficiency subtest and oral reading fluency throughout the entire K-12 age range. And we have to also be careful about looking for compensators. If you have a child who has a good verbal skills in the top half of the population, pay very close attention to the relationship between the timed and untimed version of their word reading. So this is obviously a biased opinion, but I think the WIAT-4 is going to be one of the most valid tests for dyslexia. Once again, I didn't get a chance to unpack dyslexia, but dyslexia among reading research just means poor word reading. Everything else we hear about, visual, spatial, perceptual, that is all part of popular lore. So dyslexia refers to the bottom end of the reading continuum of kids that really struggle, and it interferes with their comprehension and their academics, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very valid test of that. And I think I need to stop here because I'm coming to the end of this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give, you have these notes available. They should be self-explanatory. I do want to give just a quick little summary here. Oh, that's not the same summary that I thought I had. All right. So anyway, I was just going to summarize that we have a phoneme-based writing system. And as a result, if you have problems accessing the phonemic structure of the language, I thought I was going to get into it, but I didn't get into the whole research to show that it's not visual memory. You can go to the Reading League, Google my name, and watch that, and I give a more detailed presentation. Multiple reasons why we know it's not visual memory. Our intuition fails us miserably when we think that somehow reading is based on visual memory. That's basically, I don't know if you have questions you want to hit me with. Obviously, I'm biased. I think this is where we've got the state of the art right now with the WIAT-4. I encourage people to make use of it. So do we have any questions in the chat box? I know that our technical time is up here, but I'm not necessarily interested in booking. I'm happy to stick around and answer questions. Are you folks still able to hear me here?
Yes.
So do you have any questions? If anybody's still left in the stadium here.
There were some questions just about the past test, how long it takes, and about programs you recommend for helping struggling readers.
Yeah, the past test is going to take anywhere from 1 to about 8 minutes, depending on the child, and it has its discontinue rules and things like that. There are ways of using it as a screener where you cap how far you go, so you don't care if the child has much better skills. You're trying to screen for the bottom end, but generally speaking, it's gonna be, give yourself, I'd say, 5 or 6 minutes. But the past, in many ways, it's superseded by the WIAT-4 because the WIAT-4 is normed. I think the two of them can work a little bit side by side because there's this whole issue in the school psychology field in particular of subtest reliability. And if you gave the past an addition on at a different testing session, you'd always want to give the norm one first because you wouldn't want the non-norm one to give them practice for the normed one. That was true when I've always done the CTOP. I think the CTOP is a great adjunct to the WIAT-4. They're a little bit apples and oranges, but there is a certain overlap that is very useful. There's tons of stuff on the WIAT that's not on the CTOP and vice versa. But so giving more than one task from a different battery in a different session, and again, give the past after you've given a normed version, whether it's the elision from the CTOP. I did that for years. I gave the elision for the CTOP before I gave the past in another session and looked at how the two corresponded. And that helps reduce the concern over subtest reliability. For those not familiar, subtest reliability is, how do you know when you gave a subtest to that kid and you're interpreting that wasn't a really bad day for them, or that wasn't the best possible day they'd ever have in their whole career and just happen to know the right items or whatever. And so you give another test from another battery, and if the results are pretty similar, you feel a little bit more confident that it wasn't a fluke. That's putting in very common everyday terms, not very technical. But so the past, I think, can be used as a good adjunct to this. In terms of recommending programs, I'm a little bit wary about doing that because there's so few programs out there that have a lot of good research on them. I strongly recommend you Google IES practice guides, and the IES practice guides will tell you about the research-based principles that are needed for teaching kids and intervening with kids. We really don't have much by way of quote-unquote research-based programs where the program was studied as a program for the purpose of determining efficacy. That's not how reading research works. It's not like consumer reports. And so the reading panel, number one, and the IES practice guides, number two, they both try to derive research-based principles for teaching. And I think that's really where the focus is. And then the more educators know about those, the better they are at selecting and in many cases piecemealing and putting together different types of instructional approaches, interventions, programs, or whatever. rather than just go with whatever the publisher says. Oh yeah, our program, every program, by the way, on the planet says they're research-based, and they all say, yeah, we do that, we do that, we do that, we check it, because that's advertising. That's what they do. So so I'm a little bit reluctant to do that and just try to get people to get more up to speed on the skills that kids need, and then direct energies toward addressing those skills. And you're going to use programs for that, by the way. I realize that, but I mean, it makes us more informed consumers. And there are a lot of good phonic programs out there. There are good phonemic awareness programs out there. And I would feel reluctant to recommend one, because I may find out later that the one I recommend isn't nearly as good as a couple others, you know, and then I end up, you know, giving people bad advice. So I feel like we have to get up to speed on how this all works, and that allows us to be better at evaluating the materials we purchase to help kids.
There's several questions in general about using the WIAT to assess dyslexia, and one specific question of, if someone has severe dyslexia, do you stop trying to assess decoding fluency?
Okay, let me take them one at a time. And based on working memory, I'll probably forget the second one by the time I'm done with the first one, all right? But so okay. The first one, yeah, here's one of the problems. It always concerns me when I hear stories about schools sending kids out for an outside expensive evaluation to determine if the kid has dyslexia. When I hear that, right away I say, wow, we have this huge research database on dyslexia, and the researchers would look at that and go, what are they even talking about? So they must be thinking of some traditional misunderstanding of what dyslexia is. Let me give you an analogy. See, schools can determine if kids have dyslexia. You give them a reading test, okay? It's the low end of the reading continuum, despite adequate effort, adequate opportunity, and it's not due to blindness, deafness, or severe intellectual disability. In other words, intellectual ability that's so severe, they have a hard time understanding oral receptive language. If you can have a conversation with a child with a moderate intellectual disability, and you can have a back and forth conversation, they can understand language, they actually have the building blocks for word level reading. It's going to take them longer, it's going to take more effort, but they can build those skills. Anyway, getting back to the more direct question, it would almost be like this. It would almost be like if someone were to say, all right, here's your job, Dave. You're going to evaluate to determine if someone is tall or not. And so two people come walking in the room, and they're both 6'7". You know the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to look down at their feet and make sure somebody's not standing up on a box. But if both of them are 6'7" and they're standing on the floor, I'm going to say they're tall. And so the same is true with dyslexia. Research on dyslexia says that it is the low end of the continuum despite adequate effort or opportunity. And there's not one of those other caveats that I just mentioned. Now, granted, if you want to flesh that out a little bit, you want to get at why the child is struggling, and you do something like the CTOP or the WIAT-4 subtest or the test of word reading efficiency or some of these other ones that can get at why it is the child is so poor at word reading. But the idea of spending money for a school district to determine if a kid has dyslexia is like trying to determine if the 6'7" person is tall or not. It really, from the standpoint of the reading research, it makes no sense. So the only thing I can assume is it's built on faulty ideas of what dyslexia even is. So that's the first question. Yes, the WIAT has always, even the first version of the WIAT has been able to tell you if a child has dyslexia, sort of. Maybe not as confidently, because the original WIAT had the word reading subtest, and they didn't have a nonsense word test yet till the second one. But still, a low score in that is, let's put it this way, very suggestive of it. And then you start looking at the other elements of the phonological core deficit. You see the poor nonsense word reading, you see the poor rapid naming, phonemic awareness, etc. Dyslexia. So we've given it a mystique it does not deserve. And researchers have been looking turning over every rock related to dyslexia for 50 years, and we're not finding the kind of things that support some of the popular ideas that are out there. So yeah, the WIAT-3 was able to determine dyslexia, okay? So we have to understand what it is, so we're not spending a lot of money trying to get answers that we can answer right within our school district. Okay, the second one was about giving up on kids. No, there was a really interesting study with like over 230 some individuals with dyslexia from age 5 to 55 going through a clinic in Canada. It was reported in a journal called Annals of Dyslexia, a technical journal on dyslexia from the International Dyslexia Association. And not one person one person did not make progress in the phonemic awareness training, and 75% of these dyslexics ended up with perfectly normal phonemic awareness after the intensive training. And they made a standard deviation. It was like 17 standard score point gains on average across the board, regardless of age. So what that means is we need to think about that. That means one person did not make progress. And I got to meet that author, and I said, can we track that person down? I'd like to go find out why that person didn't make progress. There could have been an audiological thing going on, right? Which is very rare, but it could happen. And so he said, unfortunately, that was so long ago, and he'd have no way of tracking them down. But the point I'm trying to make is, do the math. That is less than 1/10 of 1% of dyslexics that did not make progress in that area. I'm not saying 1/10 of 1% of the population. 1/10 of 1% of dyslexics. So we need to move forward and say, no, this child can learn these skills, and we are going to be wrong less than 1/10 of 1% of the time. So that's the attitude we need to take. And who knows what was going on in that odd situation? As I said, there could have been, maybe it's an audiological thing. I tutored a 30-year-old who turned out to have a long history of hearing problems with early infections, et cetera, and couldn't tell the difference between, say, a short E and a short A. And it took a lot of work, and we finally got past that. Was that what was going on with that person? Who knows? And this person had an audiological thing going on. And of course, we obviously want to check with the nurse and make sure the hearing's okay and all that kind of thing. So anyway, no, I don't think there's ever a case where we give up on it. The only time I'd ever give up on it, as I said earlier, if a person has such low language skills that they cannot understand receptive spoken language, then they're not going to become word readers.
Okay, there's several questions about the FAR, like comparing that with the WIAT, or how orthographic processing, varies with the FAR.
Yeah, I have to be careful because someone had it at one point and they showed it to me and they're flipping through real quick. So my assessment is going to be largely uninformed, okay? But the one thing I will mention is I have heard that with the FAR, there's like a 10-second time element for the phonemic awareness. So that's not going to be particularly useful because really what we want to know is, does the child have automatic access? There were a number of, in the 1990s, 80s into the 1990s, in the research community, there was kind of a difference of opinion. I'm not saying it's totally gone, but it's largely been resolved, where you had two camps. You had one camp that was saying, oh, orthographic skills are their own separate entity, independent of phonological skills and letter sound knowledge. And they pointed to tasks that were called orthographic processing tests. One of them was the word likeness test. So you may get like BIP/LMK, and the child, and you get a whole bunch of these, they get harder and harder. The child has to circle which one's more like a real word. Well, obviously BIP because it has a vowel in it and LMK doesn't. And this is testing your general orthographic knowledge that comes through what's called statistical learning. Statistical learning involves noticing patterns. Even though if you're not directly taught them, you notice patterns, orthographic patterns. So you never begin a word with CK, but you might end a word with CK. Another example would be BBAP versus BAPP. Well, you'd circle the second one because you don't see a word ever starting with double B. And other than llama, you don't see it, a word starting with a double consonant in English. And but you could see it end with a double consonant. So that's telling us something about the person's, what they've abstracted from experience with words. And then there were other tests like these homophone or pseudo-homophone tests. So a pseudo-homophone would be BRANE versus BRAIN, and you had to circle which one was correct. Now you're getting into specific orthographic knowledge, not general orthographic knowledge. Anyway, they had a few subtests like that, and they noticed the correlations, with the correlations with reading. And when they did the, like a regression formula, they pulled out the contribution of letter sound knowledge and the contribution of phonemic awareness. By the way, phonemic awareness that was not of the phonemic proficiency sort. Phonemic awareness that was very highly insensitive. So very highly insensitive or untimed segmentation tasks, because the correlation with reading disappears after first grade for the most part. Very sensitive tasks, when it's correlating throughout the entire age range, would be like your phonemic proficiency subtest. So they weren't doing that. So as a result, they came to a conclusion that it was a separate factor. Well, anyway, in 2006, a researcher, Jennifer Burton in Australia, did a review of this issue of orthographic processing. And then shortly thereafter, there were some longitudinal studies where they took orthographic processing tasks, data on tasks in first grade and reading in first grade, came back in third grade, and they found that the orthographic skill, quote unquote, in first grade did not predict third grade reading, but first grade reading predicted the orthographic skills and reading in third grade. So the other school of thought back in the 90s was, no, this is just more advanced knowledge of the code. And it turns out the research seems to support that. So we really don't have a separate orthographic skill independent of how we understand the relationship between phonology and orthography and letter sound skills. And as I said earlier, Ehri's theory can explain all those orthographic quote unquote processing results beautifully and fit within the context of her theory. But the problem is too many people don't have a good understanding of her theory. And so as a result, they're flailing about trying to find some explanation. But it's very well explained within Ehri's theory, her two theories, her developmental theory of how we developmentally get better at remembering words, and then the actual mechanism, the actual process of remembering words. So as a result, I do find that those types of orthographic processing subtests might be useful to some degree, as I mentioned earlier, because it's telling you a little bit about what the child has absorbed about words and what they've derived in terms of recognizing patterns through statistical learning. But orthographic learning is not statistical learning. Well, there's two levels of orthographic learning: statistical learning, general principles, but then orthographic mapping is specific, this pronunciation to that particular spelling pattern. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the little bit of exposure I had to the FAR would be that I think there's some useful subtests on there, but I think you need to plot it within a different interpretive framework based on a lot of the reading research and simple view of reading, et cetera. But I still think the WIAT-4 is much more targeted. And again, I'm biased, but.
We have lots of great questions, but I think maybe some of them we'll have to try to answer offline, maybe afterward to individuals. There are three questions that a lot of people have. There is a recording of the session, and with your login information after the webinar concludes, you'll be able to access the recording with the same login information you used to join today. There will be a survey for the certificate of attendance. So you do the post-webinar survey that will be sent out. And then the third question is about the handouts or of the slides, which are available. Sherry, can you explain again where that's located? I'm not sure she's still in the meeting. Let's see if I can find it. So in the event resources in the chat box is where the handout is located. So with that, thank you for the webinar today. There was lots of comments in the chat, Dr. Kilpatrick, of how much people enjoyed the information and they want more. They wanted more time, more.
Well, I will tell you this, if you can capture those questions that still are there, send them to me. I can, and if there's a way for you to make them available to participants, I can answer them in a Word file.
Yes, we can do that. We can send that to you so we can get back to participants with more answers. Okay, thank you very much.